Last week in our Sales Accelerator, we introduced you to the DEM, the Disruptive Engagement Model. If you remember, it has three parts. First, to disrupt. Second, to engage. And third, to explore. And as we ended last week, we said that we'd pick up this week's accelerator around the ideas of exploration. So let's talk about that. Before we dive in, it's critical that we remember what an end in mind is. End in mind to us represents three words. What do I expect the client to either say, or do, or decide? So think about that. End in mind. What do we expect them to say, do, or decide as a result of any client interaction, especially as we're introducing a new hypothesis of value to this client? Well, I would imagine that most of us would find that after we share this hypothesis, that they're not likely to buy or to say, hey, let's sign an agreement. They're actually looking to decide whether or not we should meet. So we want to be very clear up front in our disruption and in our engagement to make sure we share our end in mind. If you remember, it sounds something like this. Paul, I'm Scott Savage from Franklin Covey. You and I have not met. I was speaking with Susan last week, and she thought that you and I ought to meet. I'm wondering if you have 3 minutes that I could share what Susan and I discussed to determine whether or not you think that we should meet. They say yes. So now I share my value hypothesis. And so what I just set up there was the end in mind. Let's share the hypothesis, and then let's make sure you believe that it's valuable for us to meet. So the next step then would be to explore. So after I share my hypothesis, what I want to start with is an open-ended question that allows them to engage and explore with me around their feelings of what I've just shared to them. So as you think about it, I might finish my hypothesis and say something like this. Well, considering, Paul, what we've just shared with you, what are some of your thoughts about this hypothesis that I'm bringing to you? Or I might say something like, you know, as Susan and I were discussing this, we thought that it might be valuable for us to have a further conversation. What are some of your thoughts about these topics? We want an open-ended question that allows them to now explore together and confirm whether or not it makes sense. There are two principles that we're trying to engage as we explore. The first one is confirmation. I don't want this person, Paul, to assume that just because Susan thinks we should meet, that automatically that we should get together. The whole reason we're testing this is to make sure the topic makes sense and that it would be valuable enough for he and I to spend this time together. So confirmation is a big deal. The second thing I'm trying to test here is whether or not they believe we actually have a transfer of motivation. I'm motivated to talk to you because I think the value hypothesis is quite powerful. Otherwise, we wouldn't be engaging. What I'm trying to test here and explore is whether or not Paul believes that there's enough value that we should meet together. I want to make sure there's mutuality of effort. And so the transfer of motivation is to call that person into action by asking them, what do they believe, what are their takes on these particular topics? Because if they like where we're going, I'm probably going to follow up by closing with my end in mind. I'm going to simply say, well, it sounds like what Susan and I were talking about last week does make sense and we ought to get together. Or another way I might say that is, it sounds like we ought to meet. When would be a good time this next week where we could get together? The whole point here is we disrupt, we engage around the value hypothesis, and then we simply ask for an exploration or a confirmation and a transfer of motivation. So it's not just me pushing for this meeting, but we have mutuality of effort and a mutual belief that it would be worthwhile sharing these things together. The disruptive engagement model: disrupt, engage, explore. Today, we want you to focus on how can you transfer motivation and confirm interest and not just force another meeting, but to engage them in such a way that they want to meet, not just us wanting to meet. Have a great week selling.